Sometimes the loneliest souls find each other in the most unexpected places. In a forgotten frontier town where trust is scarce, a weathered cowboy discovers something that will change both their lives forever. Bound in a cage and sentenced to death, a wild wolf waits for execution. The townsfolk see only a dangerous beast that threatens their livestock. But when their eyes meet, the cowboy sees something different, a fellow outcast who knows what it means to be alone. The iron bars that hold the wolf prisoner seem to cage more than just one creature. They hold the fear and prejudice of an entire community, the kind of fear that builds walls between hearts that might otherwise understand each other. One man's act of mercy will test everything he believes about loyalty and friendship. Can their bond survive when the town turns against them both? Before we jump back into this incredible journey together, please tell us where you're tuning in from tonight. And if this story truly touches your heart deeply, make sure you're definitely subscribed. Because tomorrow I've saved something absolutely, truly extra special just for you wonderful folks right out there watching us. Jack Sullivan had been writing in the same worn leather journal for 12 years now, its pages yellowed and edges frayed from countless nights by dying campfires. The journal held more than words. It carried the weight of every mile he'd traveled, every disappointment that had shaped him, every sunset he'd watched alone. At 53, Jack's face bore the deep lines of a man who'd seen too much weather and not enough kindness. His hands, rough as old bark, turned the familiar pages filled with sketches of landscapes and notes about work found and lost. Maps he'd drawn marked the territories of his wandering, from the cattle ranches of Montana down through the mining camps of Colorado, always moving when the loneliness became too heavy to bear. Millfield, Arizona Territory, wasn't much different from the dozen other frontier towns he'd drifted through since losing the family farm. Dust-covered buildings lined a single main street, their false fronts trying to appear more substantial than they were. The people here carried the same hard expressions he'd seen everywhere, suspicious eyes that measured a stranger's worth in the time it took to spit tobacco juice into the dirt. 3 months he'd been here now, longer than he'd stayed anywhere in recent memory. The work was steady enough, repairing fences for the widow Patterson, mucking stalls at the livery stable, occasional odd jobs when someone needed an extra pair of hands. He slept in the loft above the stable, paying his rent to old Henrik, who asked few questions and expected fewer answers. The journal entry from his first day in Millfield was brief. Another town that doesn't need another drifter. But the mountains here remind me of home, and the work might last through winter. Those mountains did remind him of home, of the ranch in Wyoming where he'd grown up, where his father had taught him to read the weather in the clouds and find water by watching where animals gathered. The drought of '79 had taken it all. The cattle first, then the crops, finally the land itself when the banknotes came due. His parents had died that winter, his father of a weak heart, his mother of pure heartbreak. Jack had tried working other men's ranches after that, but nothing felt right. The skills were the same, riding, roping, mending what was broken, but the heart had gone out of it. He'd joined the army for a few years, served in some godforsaken campaigns against Apache raiders that he tried not to think about anymore. When his enlistment ended, he'd just started walking, carrying everything he owned in a bedroll and saddlebags, working where he could, moving when the restlessness took hold. The people of Millfield had accepted him the way frontier towns accepted, all drifters, with wary tolerance. Sheriff Hawkins, a thick-set man with suspicious eyes, had made it clear that troublemakers moved on quickly. Martha Henderson, who ran the Red Dog Saloon, served him whiskey without conversation, and seemed to prefer it that way. Mayor Collins, a small man with big opinions about everything, had nodded approvingly when Jack proved he could work without causing problems. But it was the children who reminded Jack most of what he'd lost. They'd gather sometimes to watch him work, their curious faces pressed against fence posts as he repaired gates or shod horses. They reminded him of himself at that age, when the world seemed full of possibilities and every stranger might have an interesting story to tell. In his journal he'd written, "The boy Jimmy reminds me of myself. Same restless energy, same questions about what lies beyond the next ridge. His mother pulls him away when she sees me watching. Can't blame her. These days, trust is a luxury most folks can't afford." The town operated on simple rules. Work hard, mind your own business, and don't make waves. The unspoken rule that governed everything else was fear. Fear of Indians, though none had been seen in these parts for 2 years. Fear of outlaws, though. The worst criminals seemed to be the occasional drunk cowhand on Saturday night. Fear of anything wild or unpredictable that might disturb the fragile order they'd built in this harsh land. Jack understood that fear. He'd felt it himself during those first months after losing the farm, when every sunrise brought another reminder of how quickly a man's whole world could crumble. But somewhere in his wandering years, he'd learned that fear was like a rope around a man's neck. The tighter you pulled, the harder it became to breathe. The morning he first saw the wolf, Jack had been shoeing horses for Henrik when the commotion started. Shouts echoed from the main street, drawing people from shops and houses like iron filings to a magnet. Jack set down his hammer and walked toward the crowd, curious but not expecting much. Frontier towns found excitement in small things: a traveling preacher, a fight over card games, news of gold strikes in distant territories. But this was different. The crowd pressed around something in the center of the street, voices raised. In that particular mixture of fear and fascination that accompanied real danger, Jack worked his way forward, using his height to see over the shorter townspeople. That's when he saw the cage. It was a crude thing, built from iron bars and wooden planks, the kind of makeshift prison that said more about the builder's fear than their craftsmanship. Inside, pressed against the far corner, was a wolf larger than any Jack had seen in his traveling years. Its coat was the color of winter shadows, dark gray shot through with silver that caught the morning light like frost on bare branches. "Caught him killing Morrison's sheep," someone was saying. "Killed 3 ewes before Morrison's dogs cornered. Him. Should have shot him on the spot," another voice added. "Wolves are nothing but trouble." Jack found himself studying the animal's eyes, intelligent, alert, but not with the mindless ferocity he'd expected. There was something almost human in that gaze, a recognition that transcended species. The wolf wasn't snarling or throwing itself against the bars like a maddened beast. Instead, it watched the crowd with the same wary assessment Jack had seen in his own reflection during those first hard months on the road. "We'll put him down tomorrow morning," Sheriff Hawkins announced, his voice carrying the authority of finality. "Public execution, so everyone can see justice done. Can't have predators, thinking they can take what they please." The crowd murmured approval, but Jack noticed a few uncomfortable glances. Execution seemed like a harsh word for an animal following its nature. Still, sheep were money, and money was survival in a place like Millfield. As the crowd began to disperse, Jack lingered. The wolf had shifted position slightly, and their eyes met through the iron bars. For a moment that stretched longer than it should have, man and beast regarded each other with something approaching understanding. In that moment, Jack saw himself, caged by circumstances, judged by people who didn't really know him, waiting for a fate decided by others. The wolf's expression seemed to hold the same resignation Jack had felt when the bankmen came for the farm, the same quiet dignity he'd tried to maintain when the army sergeants treated him like another piece of equipment. Walking back to the stable that evening, Jack pulled out his journal and wrote, "Saw something today that reminded me of looking in a mirror. Sometimes the bars that hold us prisoner aren't made of iron. They're made of other people's fear and our own acceptance of their judgment." He paused, pen hovering over the paper, then added, "The wolf has better reasons for hope than most folks I know. At least his cage has a key." The silver pocket watch had been his father's and his grandfather's before that. Jack pulled it from his vest pocket as he sat in the stable loft, the familiar weight of it solid and reassuring in his palm. The face was scratched from years of honest work, but the hands still moved with precision, marking time with the same steady reliability that had guided 3 generations of Sullivan men. 11:30. In 6.5 hours, the wolf would die. Jack had tried to sleep, but rest wouldn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those intelligent amber eyes staring back at him through the iron bars. The town had made its decision with the swift certainty that frontier justice demanded, quick, final, and designed more to ease fear than serve any higher purpose. He snapped the watch closed and walked to the window, looking out over the sleeping town. A few oil lamps flickered in windows, but most of Millfield had settled into the deep silence that came before dawn. The cage sat in the middle of the main street, like a dark monument to human authority over the wild world. The memory came without warning, as they often did when sleep eluded him. He was 12 years old again, standing with his father at the edge of their property in Wyoming. A young elk had wandered into their corral, confused and frightened, its legs tangled in the wire fencing. "Easy now," his father had said, approaching, the struggling animal with calm, deliberate movements. "Fear makes everything worse, son. Animals know when you're afraid, just like they know when you mean them harm." His father had worked patiently to free the elk, talking in low, soothing tones, while Jack watched from a safe distance. When the wire finally came free, the elk had stood for a moment, looking at the man who had helped it. Then it had bounded away into the forest, leaving Jack with a lesson that had shaped his understanding of the world. "Every living thing wants the same basic things, Jack," his father had told him that day. "Freedom, safety, and a chance to live according to its nature. When we can help provide those things, we become something better than what we were." Jack opened the watch again. 11:45. Down in the street, a figure moved in the shadows, near the cage. Jack leaned forward, trying to make out who would be visiting the condemned animal at this hour. It was young Tommy Morrison, the same boy whose father's sheep had been killed. The boy approached the cage cautiously, carrying something in his hands. Tommy knelt beside the bars and pushed a piece of bread through the iron gaps. The wolf approached slowly, sniffed the offering, then took it gently from the boy's fingers. For several minutes, boy and wolf regarded each other in the moonlight. 2 young creatures separated by species and circumstances, but connected by something simpler than fear. When Tommy finally walked away, Jack felt something shift inside his chest, like ice breaking up on a spring river. The boy had seen what Jack had seen, not a monster, but a living being deserving of basic compassion. If a child could recognize that truth, what did it say about the adults who had chosen execution over understanding? Jack pulled on his boots and climbed down from the loft. The night air was cool against his face, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. His footsteps sounded unnaturally loud in the silence as he approached the cage. The wolf raised its head as Jack drew near, but showed no sign of alarm. Up close, Jack could see the animal's true condition, lean but not starving, with small scars that spoke of a hard life in wild country. This wasn't some rabid beast driven to desperation. This was a creature trying to survive in a world that offered fewer and fewer places for wild things to exist. Jack sat down in the dirt a few feet from the cage, his back against a hitching post. The wolf watched him with patient curiosity, as if recognizing that this human was different from the ones who had built its prison. "I know what it's like," Jack said quietly, not caring if anyone heard him talking to an animal. "Being judged for something you can't help, punished for following your nature." The wolf's ears pricked forward slightly, responding to the calm, and tone, if not the words. Jack pulled out his pocket watch again. Midnight now. 6 hours until the execution. 6 hours to decide whether he was the kind of man who could watch injustice happen, or the kind who felt compelled to act. "My father would have set you free," he told the wolf. "He believed that mercy was what separated civilized men from savages." said that anyone could choose revenge, but it took real strength to choose compassion. The wolf had moved closer to the bars, close enough that Jack could see the intelligence in its eyes. There was no wildness there, no threatening aggression, just the calm acceptance of a creature that had faced death before and understood its finality. Jack thought about the town meeting earlier that evening, the eager voices calling for blood. Sheriff Hawkins had made it clear that the execution would serve as a warning to other predators, a demonstration of human dominance over the natural world. Mayor Collins had spoken about setting an example, about protecting property and maintaining order, but Jack had heard something else in their voices, the satisfaction that came from having power over something helpless. It was the same satisfaction he'd heard in the voices of bank officials when they'd foreclosed on the family farm, the same tone army officers used when sending men into battles that served no purpose beyond proving their authority. The pocket watch felt heavier in his hand now, weighted with the significance of moments that change a life's direction. His father had carried this same watch when he'd made the decision to help that trapped elk. He'd carried it when he'd chosen to marry Jack's mother, despite her family's objections. He'd carried it when he'd stood up to the local cattle baron who'd tried to buy their land for half its worth. Time was running out, and Jack knew that some decisions couldn't be postponed. This was one of those moments that defined a man's character, when choosing what was right meant risking everything familiar and safe. Jack stood up and walked closer to the cage. The wolf rose as well, approaching the bars with careful steps. When Jack extended his hand through the iron gaps, the wolf sniffed his fingers, then allowed Jack to touch the side of its head. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through Jack's chest, the simple recognition of one living being acknowledging another. "You need a home," Jack whispered, "and I need a friend." The words came from someplace deeper than conscious thought, carrying a truth that surprised him with its clarity. They were both outcasts now, both condemned by a society that valued conformity over compassion, but together they might find something that neither could achieve alone. Jack pulled his hand back and checked the watch one final time. 5:30. An hour and a half until dawn. An hour and a half to decide whether he would remain a passive observer of injustice or become an active agent of mercy. The weight of that choice pressed down on him like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The wolf settled back against the far side of the cage, but its eyes never left Jack's face. In that steady gaze, Jack saw something he hadn't experienced in years. The possibility of being understood without having to explain himself. He closed the pocket watch with a decisive snap and headed back toward the stable. There were preparations to make if he was going to follow his conscience instead of his caution. Behind him, the wolf watched until Jack disappeared into the shadows, as if sensing that the man's decision would determine both their fates. The bolt. Cutters had been hanging in Henrik's tool shed for years, their handles worn smooth by countless hands and their jaws stained with rust from the territory's harsh weather. Jack hefted their familiar weight as the first pale light began to show above the eastern mountains. In an hour, the town would wake to find the cage empty and their prisoner gone. Jack had spent the remaining darkness hours in careful preparation. His few belongings were already packed and secured to his horse: the journal, a change of clothes, his father's watch, and what little money he'd managed to save. There would be no coming back from this choice, no explanations that would satisfy a community built on fear and order. The streets lay empty in the grey pre-dawn light, windows dark except for the occasional flicker of an early riser's lamp. Jack's boots made soft sounds on the packed earth as he approached the cage, the bolt cutters concealed beneath his coat. Every shadow seemed to hide watching eyes. Every sound carried the potential for discovery and disaster. The wolf raised its head as Jack drew near, amber eyes reflecting the growing light. There was something different in the animal's posture now, an alertness that suggested it sensed the change in Jack's intentions. Animals possessed instincts that humans had forgotten, the ability to read purpose in the subtlest movements and expressions. Jack knelt beside the cage and pulled out the bolt cutters. The iron bars were thicker than he'd hoped, designed by men who understood the strength of desperate creatures. The first cut would be the hardest, requiring him to position the tool carefully and apply maximum pressure without making excessive noise. "Easy," he whispered, more to himself than the wolf. "We're going to do this quiet and careful." The wolf had moved to the opposite corner of the cage, giving Jack room to work while maintaining visual contact. Its intelligence was unmistakable. This was no mindless beast, but a thinking creature that understood the significance of what was happening. Jack positioned the bolt cutters on the first bar and squeezed the handles together. The metal resisted, then gave with a sharp crack that seemed to echo off every building in town. Jack froze, listening for any sign that the sound had awakened someone, but the town remained silent. The second cut went easier. The bar weakened. By the first break, Jack worked methodically, cutting 3 bars before the opening was wide enough for the wolf to squeeze through. Each cut brought its own moment of tension, the possibility that this would be the sound that brought Sheriff Hawkins running with his shotgun and his questions. When the last bar fell away, Jack stepped back and looked at what he'd accomplished. The cage that had held the wolf prisoner now gaped open like a mouth frozen in surprise. There was no taking this back, no claiming ignorance or innocent intentions. By freeing the wolf, Jack had declared himself an enemy of everything Millfield represented. The wolf approached the opening cautiously, testing the space with its muzzle before committing to movement. It paused at the threshold between captivity and freedom, looking back at Jack with what seemed like gratitude mixed with uncertainty. "Go on," Jack urged. "You're free now." But the wolf didn't run. Instead, it stepped fully out of the cage and sat down a few feet away, watching Jack with expectant eyes. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken communication that transcended the barriers of species. Jack understood. The wolf was waiting for him. "You want me to come with you?" Jack said, the realization bringing both warmth and terror. "You're not running because you know I can't stay here either." As if in response, the wolf stood and took a few steps toward the edge of town, then stopped and looked back. The message was clear. They were in this together now. 2 outcasts, bound by the choice Jack had made. Jack heard his horse snort softly from where he'd tied it behind the livery stable. Everything he'd need for survival was already secured to the saddle. Food, water, bedroll, and the skills learned from years of wandering. But those had been the preparations of a man expecting to travel alone. Now he would have a companion, whose needs and instincts were as foreign to him as his own would be to the wolf. The sound of a door opening somewhere down the street sent both man and animal into immediate alert. Jack saw lamplight spill from the bakery window as Mrs. Chen began her daily preparations. In minutes, others would follow. The blacksmith, the stable hands, the early customers drawn by the smell of fresh bread. "Time to go," Jack whispered. He whistled softly, and his horse approached with the trained obedience of an animal accustomed to traveling life. The wolf tensed at the sight of the larger creature, but showed no sign of fear or aggression. Jack swung into the saddle and looked down at his unlikely companion. "Can you keep up?" he asked. The wolf's response was to trot toward the western edge of town, moving with the effortless pace of a creature born to cover long distances. Jack touched his heels to his horse's sides and followed, keeping the animal at a walk to avoid drawing attention. They moved through the awakening town like ghosts, past the shuttered shops and sleeping houses where people dreamed of ordinary days and predictable tomorrows. Jack felt a strange lightness in his chest, as if some weight he'd carried for years had finally been lifted. For the first time since losing the farm, he was moving towards something instead of away from it. Behind them, the empty cage sat in the middle of the street, like an accusation waiting to be discovered. Jack didn't look back. There was nothing in Millfield he needed to see again, nothing that had ever truly belonged to him anyway. As they reached the outskirts of town, the Wolf broke into an easy lope that covered ground with surprising speed. Jack's horse settled into a matching pace, and together they headed toward the mountains, where the morning light was painting the peaks gold and purple. Jack pulled his father's watch from his vest pocket and checked the time. 6:15. In another 15 minutes, Sheriff Hawkins would discover the empty cage and begin organizing a pursuit. By then, Jack intended to be far enough into the wilderness that tracking them would require more dedication than most townsfolk possessed. The bolt cutters lay abandoned beside the broken cage, their purpose fulfilled and their usefulness ended. But the act they had enabled was just beginning. As the distance between them and Millfield grew, Jack felt the stirring of something he hadn't experienced in years, the sense that his life was moving toward meaning instead of simply marking time. Beside him, the wolf ran with the fluid grace of a creature finally free to follow its nature. And Jack knew, with the certainty that comes from making choices that align with conscience, that he had found his nature too. The lean-to Jack built against the rocky outcrop was nothing fancy, just pine branches woven between two fallen logs and covered with brush to block the wind. But as he secured the last of the makeshift walls with strips of leather from his saddlebags, it felt like the first real home he'd had since losing the family farm. 3 days they'd been traveling together now, putting distance between themselves. And the inevitable pursuit. The wolf. Jack had started thinking of him as Ghost, for the way he seemed to appear and disappear among the trees had proven to be an ideal traveling companion. He moved silently through the forest, never ranging far from Jack's horse, always alert for signs of danger or opportunity. But trust was still a work in progress. Ghost watched from a respectful distance as Jack finished the shelter, amber eyes tracking every movement with careful attention. The wolf had shown no aggression, but he maintained an invisible boundary that neither of them had yet crossed. They were partners in escape, but not yet friends. "What do you think?" Jack asked, settling back on his heels to survey his handiwork. "Not much, but it'll keep the rain off when those clouds decide to open up." Ghost tilted his head at the sound of Jack's voice, ears pricked forward in what might have been curiosity or simple acknowledgement. Jack had taken to talking to the wolf during their travels, finding comfort in having someone to share his thoughts with, even if the conversation was one-sided. The afternoon sky was indeed threatening rain, dark clouds building over the mountain, peaks like nature's reminder that winter was coming soon. Jack had chosen this campsite for its shelter and water access, a small stream that tumbled down from the high country, providing both drink and the sound of moving water to mask their presence. Jack unpacked his supplies and began preparing a simple meal of beans and hardtack. He'd caught a rabbit that morning, but had given the entire carcass to Ghost, understanding that the wolf's needs were different from his own. Watching Ghost. Eat had been Jack's first real glimpse into the animal's true nature, efficient, clean and grateful in ways that seemed almost human. "You're hungrier than you let on," Jack had observed that morning as Ghost consumed the rabbit. "How long were you in that cage without a decent meal?" Ghost had paused in his eating to look at Jack, as if recognizing the concern in the man's voice. For a moment, their eyes had met in genuine communication, the first crack in the wall of mutual wariness. Now, as Jack stirred beans over his small fire, Ghost approached closer than he had before. Not close enough to touch, but near enough. That Jack could see the individual whiskers around his muzzle and the way his fur caught the firelight. "Getting braver," Jack noted with approval. "Or maybe just getting used to my ugly face." Ghost settled into a resting position, front paws crossed in front of him like a dog, but his posture remained alert. Jack recognized the stance. Relaxed enough to rest, ready enough to respond to any threat. It was the same way Jack had learned. To sleep during his army years, when Apache raids could come without warning. Rain began to fall just as Jack finished his meal. Fat drops that hissed against the fire and sent Ghost retreating toward the shelter. Jack quickly secured his gear and joined the wolf under the lean-to. finding himself closer to his companion than they'd been since the rescue. The shelter was cramped with both of them inside, but Ghost made no move to leave. Instead, he settled against the far wall, watching Jack with those intelligent eyes that seemed to hold entire conversations. "First time sharing a roof," Jack said, keeping his voice low and calm. "I appreciate you not trying to eat me in my sleep." As if understanding the joke, Ghost's ears flicked forward, and Jack could have sworn he saw something like amusement in the wolf's expression. The rain drummed steadily on the pine branches above them, creating a cocoon of sound that felt oddly intimate. Jack pulled out his journal and began writing by the dim light of the fire visible through the shelter opening. Writing had always helped him process the day's experiences, but now he found himself including observations about Ghost that surprised him with their detail. "Day 3 with my companion," he wrote. "The wolf shows remarkable intelligence and self-control. He understands that we're traveling together, but respects boundaries I didn't even know I'd established. Watches me constantly, but never with predator instincts. More like curiosity mixed with caution. Beginning to think the stories about wolves being mindless killers are just that, stories told by people who've never really observed them." Ghost had moved slightly closer during Jack's writing, drawn perhaps by the scratching of the pen or simply by the peaceful rhythm of shared space. When Jack looked up, he found the wolf watching the movement of his hand across the paper with evident fascination. "Never seen writing before, have you?" Jack asked. "Different kind of communication. Humans use marks on paper to remember things and share thoughts." Jack held the journal toward Ghost, letting him sniff the pages. The wolf's nose twitched as he took in the sense of ink and paper and Jack's own lingering touch. When Jack pulled the journal back, Ghost's eyes followed it with what seemed like genuine interest. "You're full of surprises," Jack murmured. "Makes me wonder what other assumptions people make about your kind that turn out to be wrong." The rain continued through the evening, turning their temporary camp into a more permanent situation. Jack shared some of his dried meat with Ghost, tossing small pieces within the wolf's reach and watching as he accepted them with careful dignity. Each exchange felt like progress, building a foundation of mutual respect that went beyond simple coexistence. As full darkness settled over the forest, Jack prepared his bedroll in one corner of the shelter. Ghost remained in his chosen spot, but Jack noticed that the wolf had positioned himself so that he could see both the shelter entrance and Jack's sleeping place. Protective positioning, Jack realized. Ghost was standing guard. "You don't have to watch over me," Jack said, as he settled into his blankets. "But I'm grateful you want to." Ghost's only response was to rest his head on his front paws, but his eyes remained open and alert. As Jack drifted towards sleep, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the security that came from having someone else share the responsibility of survival. In the morning, Jack woke to find Ghost gone from the shelter. For a moment, panic flared in his chest. Had the wolf finally decided that freedom meant traveling alone? But when Jack emerged from the lean-to, he found Ghost sitting nearby with a fresh rabbit at his feet. The message was unmistakable. Ghost had provided breakfast for both of them. For the first time since the rescue, Jack smiled with genuine joy. The wanted poster was nailed to a pine tree at the edge of what had once been their peaceful camp, its stark black lettering harsh against the pale bark. Jack stood reading the words that reduced his life to a handful of accusations and a price on his head. Jack Sullivan, wanted for theft of property and harboring a dangerous animal. 100 reward, dead or alive. Below, his name was a rough sketch that captured his weathered features with uncomfortable accuracy. Someone in Millfield had provided a good description to whoever had drawn this. The poster had been posted recently. The paper was still dry despite yesterday's rain, and the nail holes were fresh in the tree bark. Ghost materialized from the underbrush with the silent grace that had inspired his name, carrying a warning in his alert posture. His ears were flattened against his head, and his nose worked constantly, testing scents that meant danger. "They're close," Jack said quietly, and Ghost's amber eyes met his in acknowledgement. Sheriff Hawkins had proven more determined than Jack had anticipated. For 5 days now, they'd been playing a deadly game of hide-and-seek through the mountain wilderness, staying just ahead of a pursuit that seemed to know exactly where they were going. Jack's military training had helped. He knew how to confuse a trail, how to use terrain to his advantage, how to think like both hunter and hunted. But the posse included men who knew these mountains as well as Jack did, and they had resources he lacked. Fresh horses, multiple riders to spread out and cover more ground, and the kind of determination that came from righteous anger rather than simple duty. Jack pulled the poster down and crumpled it in his fist. The paper felt like an accusation, in his hands, reducing everything he'd done to the level of common criminality, property theft, as if Ghost had been nothing more than stolen merchandise instead of a living being condemned to die for following his nature. The irony wasn't lost on him. In freeing Ghost, Jack had become exactly what the wolf had been, an outcast hunted by society for refusing to accept its judgment. Ghost moved closer, his nose touching Jack's hand in what had become their signal for immediate danger. Through the trees, Jack could hear the distant sound of horses moving through underbrush, the quiet voices of men trying to track without announcing their presence. Jack quickly broke down their camp, scattering the cold ashes of his fire and obliterating any signs of their presence. Ghost watched the proceedings with understanding, occasionally padding to the edge of their clearing to monitor the approaching sounds. The partnership that had begun with mutual wariness had evolved into something approaching telepathy. Ghost could read Jack's intentions from the smallest gestures, while Jack had learned to interpret the wolf's body language with increasing accuracy. When Ghost's ears swiveled toward the northwest, Jack knew that was where the greatest danger lay. They moved out of the clearing like spirits, Jack leading his horse, while Ghost ranged ahead to scout the safest route. Behind them, the voices of the posse grew clearer, Sheriff Hawkins directing his men to spread out and search for sign. "He's got to be around here somewhere," Hawkins was saying. "Man can't disappear into thin air, and that wolf leaves tracks whether he likes it or not." Jack smiled grimly at that. Ghost's tracks were nearly impossible to follow unless you knew exactly what to look for, and even then the wolf seemed to step on rocks and hard ground with an instinct that suggested generations of ancestors who had survived by being invisible. They climbed steadily higher, using a game trail that wound between granite outcroppings and dense stands of timber. Ghost moved ahead like a four-legged scout, pausing frequently to test the air and listen for pursuit. Every few hundred yards, he would return to Jack's side, touching his hand with his nose before disappearing again into the forest. The communication between them had become increasingly sophisticated. A particular tilt of Ghost's head meant water ahead. Flattened ears against his skull meant immediate danger. A direct stare with raised hackles meant stop moving and freeze until the threat passed. Jack had begun to see the world through Ghost's senses, not just the visual landscape that humans relied on, but the complex tapestry of scents and sounds that told stories invisible to civilized perception. The smell of horses on the wind, the sound of metal jingling against leather, the particular rhythm of human footsteps that differed from the natural movement of forest creatures. By midday, they had gained enough elevation to look back over the valley they'd been traveling through. Jack counted at least 6 riders spread out in a search pattern, moving methodically through the terrain like a military operation. Hawkins had organized this pursuit with more skill than Jack had given him credit for. "Professional," Jack murmured, to Ghost, who sat beside him surveying the scene below. "These aren't just angry townspeople. Some of these men know what they're doing." Ghost's ears flicked toward a sound Jack couldn't yet hear. The distant howl of tracking dogs. The posse had brought hounds, which changed everything. Even Ghost's ability to move without leaving scent would be compromised by dogs bred specifically to follow trails that seemed impossible to human noses. Jack felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the sensation he'd experienced before dangerous missions during his army years. The game had just become considerably more serious. Dogs meant they couldn't simply outrun their pursuers. They would have to outthink them. Time to get creative, Jack told Ghost, and began planning their next move. They descended the far side of the ridge, using a different route that would take them toward an area Jack remembered from his earlier travels, a section of country where multiple streams converged, and the terrain became confused and broken. Running water would confuse the dog's ability to track, and the rocky ground would make following horse tracks nearly impossible. Ghost seemed to understand the strategy instinctively, leading Jack toward water at every opportunity and choosing routes that took them across bare stone whenever possible. The wolf's knowledge of the wilderness complemented Jack's tactical thinking in ways that felt almost supernatural. As the sun began to set, they found temporary shelter in a narrow canyon, where the walls rose high enough to muffle sound and block the wind. Jack made no fire, sharing cold rations with Ghost while they listened to the distant baying of hounds that seemed to be moving in circles. "They're confused," Jack said with satisfaction. Dogs lost the scent back at the creek crossing. Ghost's relaxed posture confirmed Jack's assessment. For tonight, at least, they were safe. But the wanted poster had made one thing clear. This pursuit wouldn't end until either they escaped completely or someone paid the ultimate price for the choice Jack had made. The mountain lion struck without warning, launching itself from a ledge above as Jack and Ghost navigated a narrow section of trail. One moment they were traveling in peaceful single file, the next moment the world exploded into snarling fury and flying claws. Jack's horse reared in terror, nearly throwing him from the saddle, but his attention was fixed on the deadly battle unfolding beside the trail. The cat, a mature male easily weighing 150 pounds, had intended to take down Jack's horse. Instead, it found itself locked in combat with a wolf who moved with speed and intelligence that caught the predator off guard. Ghost fought like a creature born for battle, but the mountain lion had advantages of weight and weaponry that couldn't be overcome by courage alone. Blood flew as claws raked across Ghost's shoulder, and Jack heard a sound he never wanted to hear again, the pain-filled yelp of an animal fighting for its life. Jack dismounted and drew his rifle in one fluid motion, but the combatants were too close together for a safe shot. The cat and wolf rolled across the narrow trail in a deadly embrace, each seeking the grip that would end the fight. Jack circled the battle, rifle ready, waiting for a clear opportunity that might never come. When it came, Jack didn't hesitate. The mountain lion reared back for a killing blow to Ghost's throat, exposing its chest for the split second Jack needed. The rifle cracked like thunder in the narrow canyon, and the cat collapsed in a heap of tawny fur and sudden stillness. Ghost lay panting beside his dead opponent, blood seeping from multiple wounds. The worst was a deep gash across his left shoulder where the cat's claws had found their mark, but there were other injuries. A torn ear, scratches along his ribs, bite marks on his left front leg where he'd gotten too close to the lion's jaws. Jack dropped his rifle and knelt beside his injured companion, his hands already reaching for the medical supplies in his saddlebags. Ghost's amber eyes tracked his movements, alert despite the pain, trusting despite his vulnerability. "Easy, boy," Jack murmured, pulling out the clean bandana he kept for emergencies. "We're going to get you fixed up." Ghost didn't resist as Jack examined his wounds, understanding somehow that the man's touch meant help rather than harm. The shoulder wound was the most serious, deep enough to require stitching if it were a human injury, but Jack would have to make do with pressure bandages and hope the wolf's natural healing ability would handle the rest. Jack tore his bandana into strips, creating makeshift bandages while Ghost lay still with the patience of a creature that understood necessity. Blood soaked through the white cotton as Jack wrapped the shoulder wound, turning the fabric red with the evidence of Ghost's sacrifice. "You saved my life," Jack said as he worked, his voice thick with emotion he hadn't expected. "That cat was going for my horse, and you put yourself between us." Ghost's eyes never left Jack's face as the man tended his wounds. There was something in that steady gaze that went beyond animal trust. It was the look of a creature that had chosen to risk everything for a friend. The bandaging took the better part of an hour, Jack working with the careful precision of a man who understood that mistakes could be fatal. He'd learned field medicine during his army years, treating wounded soldiers with whatever supplies were available. The principles were the same, whether the patient was human or wolf. When he finished, Ghost's shoulder was wrapped securely, the bleeding stopped by pressure and Jack's careful work. The other wounds were less serious, but Jack cleaned and bandaged them as well, talking in low, soothing tones that seemed to ease the wolf's discomfort. "You're going to be fine," Jack assured him, though he wondered if that was true. The wound was serious, and they were days away from any kind of real medical help. If infection set in, or if the injury limited Ghost's mobility, they would both be in serious trouble. Ghost struggled to his feet, testing his weight on the injured leg. He was favoring it heavily, but he could walk. More importantly, he showed no signs of giving up. If anything, there was a new determination in his posture, as if the fight had proven something to both of them. Jack helped Ghost to a more comfortable resting spot in the shade of a large boulder, then returned to deal with the mountain lion's carcass. The animal was magnificent even in death, powerful muscles and perfect predator design that commanded respect even from the man who had killed it. But as Jack dragged the body away from their trail, he found himself thinking about the nature of violence and necessity. He'd taken no pleasure in killing the cat, but he'd felt no hesitation either. When Ghost's life was threatened, Jack's response had been immediate and decisive. That realization brought with it a deeper understanding of what had happened between them. They weren't just traveling companions anymore. They were family. The kind of family that risked everything for each other without thinking twice about the cost. Jack made camp early that day, building a small fire and preparing a comfortable resting place for Ghost. The wolf accepted his ministrations with dignity, allowing Jack to check his bandages and offer him water and food without resistance. As evening settled over the mountains, Jack sat beside his injured friend and pulled out his journal. The blood-stained bandana lay nearby, a stark reminder of how quickly life could change and how much they'd come to mean to each other. "Today I learned something about loyalty," he wrote. "Ghost put himself between me and death without hesitation, fought a creature twice his size to protect someone who was once a stranger. I've known men who wouldn't have shown that kind of courage for their own brothers." Ghost lifted his head to watch Jack write, ears pricked forward despite his obvious exhaustion. The simple act of writing seemed to fascinate the wolf, as if he understood that Jack was recording something important. Jack reached out slowly and placed his hand on Ghost's uninjured side, feeling the steady rhythm of the wolf's breathing. Ghost leaned into the touch slightly, accepting the comfort without losing his dignity. "Partners," Jack said quietly. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." Ghost's amber eyes reflected the firelight as he settled his head back down on his front paws. The blood-stained bandana around his shoulder marked him as a warrior who had proven his loyalty beyond any doubt. In the distance, coyotes called to each other across the darkness, their voices carrying news of the day's events to any who knew how to listen. But Jack and Ghost had found something more valuable than news. They had found the kind of bond that made them stronger together than either could ever be alone. Ghost found the hidden entrance on their fourth day of hiding, while his wounds healed. Jack had been tending the fire when the wolf disappeared behind what appeared to be solid rock, only to emerge moments later with an expression that demanded attention. "What is it, boy?" Jack asked, but Ghost had already turned back toward the rock face, limping slightly on his bandaged leg, but moving with unmistakable purpose. Jack followed, leading his horse through what he'd assumed was impassable terrain. But as he drew closer, he could see what Ghost's keener senses had already detected: a narrow opening concealed by the angle of overlapping stone, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The passage was barely wide enough for the horse, but it opened after 30 yards into something that took Jack's breath away. A hidden valley spread before them, perhaps a mile across and sheltered on all sides by towering canyon walls. A stream wound through its center, fed by a waterfall that tumbled from the northern rim in a ribbon of silver light. But it was more than just a perfect sanctuary. This was a place that had been home to someone long before Jack and Ghost arrived. Ancient fire pits dotted the valley floor, their stone circles weathered but still intact. Scattered among them were the remains of structures, not the temporary shelters of passing travelers, but the permanent homes of people who had lived here for generations. Ghost moved through the ruins with familiarity that seemed impossible, as if he recognized something about this place that connected to deeper memories. He paused at each fire pit, sniffing carefully, then continued toward the base of the canyon's western wall. Jack followed, leading his horse toward what appeared to be the largest of the ancient dwellings. As they drew closer, he could see that it wasn't a surface structure at all, but a natural cave that had been enlarged and modified by human hands. The entrance was tall enough for a man to walk upright, carved symbols flanking the opening like guardians of ancient secrets. Jack recognized some of the designs, spirals, and animal forms that spoke of people who had lived in harmony with the wild world rather than in opposition to it. Ghost sat down at the cave entrance and looked back at Jack expectantly, as if waiting for permission to enter a sacred space. Jack dismounted and approached slowly, feeling the weight of history in every step. Inside, the cave opened into a natural cathedral, its walls adorned with paintings that made Jack's heart race with recognition and wonder. By the light of his torch, figures emerged from the stone, humans and wolves hunting together, sharing food around fires, traveling side by side through landscapes that looked remarkably like the country he and Ghost had been crossing. The paintings told a story that stretched back generations, maybe centuries. They showed not the relationship between master and pet that Jack might have expected, but true partnerships between equals. Wolves and humans working together to survive in a harsh world, each contributing their unique strengths to the benefit of both. One painting in particular drew Jack's attention, a scene showing a wolf with distinctive markings protecting a human hunter from what appeared to be a mountain lion. The wolf in the painting bore an uncanny resemblance to Ghost, down to the silver-grey coat and intelligent amber eyes. "Your ancestors," Jack whispered, and Ghost moved closer, pressing against Jack's leg as if he too recognized the significance of what they were seeing. But there was more. Deeper in the cave, Jack discovered something that changed everything he thought he knew about Ghost's story. A section of wall showed recent paintings, not ancient artwork, but images that had been added within the last few years. These newer paintings told a story of loss and tragedy. They showed a pack of wolves, Ghost's pack, being hunted by men, with guns and traps. The images depicted the systematic destruction of an entire family group, leaving only one survivor to carry on the ancient lineage. Ghost whined softly as Jack studied these paintings, a sound filled with grief that no human language could adequately express. Jack reached down and placed his hand on the wolf's head, feeling the tremor of remembered pain that ran through his companion's body. "You weren't just any wolf," Jack said, understanding flooding through him like cold water. "You're the last of something special, aren't you? The last of a line that's been partners with humans for generations." The final painting showed a lone wolf, unmistakably Ghost, waiting in a place that looked very much like Millfield. But he wasn't hunting sheep or threatening livestock. He was searching, looking for the human partner that instinct and generations of breeding told him should exist. Jack sat down heavily on a stone that had been shaped into a bench by long-dead hands. The full weight of what had happened was finally clear. Ghost hadn't been a predator driven to desperation. He'd been a creature following genetic memory, looking for the kind of partnership his ancestors had known. The townspeople of Millfield had seen a threat where they should have seen an opportunity. They had condemned to death the very creature that could have helped them survive in country that was still wild and dangerous. "They killed your family," Jack said, his voice tight, with anger and grief. "Killed them for being what they were, for following their nature. And then they caged you for trying to find what you'd lost." Ghost moved closer, resting his head on Jack's knee in a gesture of trust and understanding that transcended species. In that moment, Jack felt the full weight of responsibility that came with being chosen by a creature whose loyalty was absolute and whose trust was sacred. The paintings told him something else as well. This valley had been a place of sanctuary for the wolf-human partnerships, a hidden refuge where the ancient bonds could be maintained even as the outside world grew hostile to such relationships. It had been waiting for them, prepared by people who understood that some bonds were too important to let die. Jack pulled out his journal and began sketching the paintings, capturing as much detail as his limited artistic skills would allow. These images were history, proof of a relationship between species that most people would consider impossible. "We're not the first," he wrote beneath his sketches. "This partnership between wolf and human goes back generations, maybe centuries. Ghost isn't just a wolf I rescued. He's the last keeper of an ancient contract between our kinds. By saving him, I didn't just gain a companion, I inherited a responsibility." As night fell over the hidden valley, Jack made camp near the cave entrance, building his fire in one of the ancient fire pits. Ghost settled beside him, his wounds healing well enough that he could move without obvious pain. For the first time since fleeing Millfield, Jack felt something approaching peace. They had found sanctuary, but more than that, they had found purpose. This place had been waiting for them, and the paintings suggested that their partnership was part of something larger than their individual survival. Jack looked up at the stars, visible through the canyon opening, then at Ghost, resting beside the fire. Tomorrow, they would explore more of the valley, but tonight it was enough to know that they had found home. "Your ancestors chose well," Jack told Ghost as he prepared for sleep. "This is a good place to make a stand." Jack spread the hand-drawn map across the flat stone that had become his planning table, weighing down the corners with carefully selected rocks. 2 weeks of reconnaissance had gone into this document. Every trail leading into the valley, every possible approach the posse might take, every defensive position that could be turned to their advantage. Ghost lay beside him, amber eyes, tracking the movement of Jack's finger as he traced potential attack routes. The wolf's wounds had healed well, leaving only faint scars beneath his silver-grey coat, but the experience had sharpened his already keen instincts for danger. "They'll come from 3 directions," Jack said, more to organize his own thoughts than to communicate with Ghost. "Hawkins is too smart to try a frontal assault through the main entrance. He'll send men around to the north and south rims, try to trap us in the valley." Jack had spent years studying terrain and tactics during his army service, learning to read landscape the way other men read books. The hidden valley was a fortress, but like all fortresses, it could become a trap if the defenders weren't careful. The map showed elevation lines, water sources, and sight lines, everything a military engineer might include in a defensive survey. But it also showed something more personal, the ancient fire pits where Ghost's ancestors had made their homes, the cave paintings that told the story of partnership stretching back generations, the places where this valley had been sanctuary for those who chose cooperation over conquest. Ghost rose and padded to the cave entrance, ears pricked towards sounds Jack couldn't yet hear. After 2 weeks of relative peace, both man and wolf had begun to hope their pursuers had given up the chase. But Ghost's sudden alertness suggested that hope had been premature. Jack rolled up his map and secured it in his saddlebags, then joined Ghost at the cave mouth. In the distance, carried on the wind that funneled down through the canyon, came the sound they'd been dreading: horses moving through the forest beyond the valley's hidden entrance. How many? Jack asked, though he knew Ghost couldn't answer. In words, the wolf's posture told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't a small search party or a few determined bounty hunters. This was the full force of Millfield's justice, complete with the additional men Sheriff Hawkins had recruited from neighboring towns. Jack pulled out his spyglass and climbed to a vantage point where he could observe the main approach without being seen. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. At least 12 riders were spread out in a search pattern, working their way systematically toward the concealed entrance. These weren't the same men who had pursued them earlier. Many were strangers, professionals hired to finish what local enthusiasm had started. Hawkins sat his horse at the center of the formation, directing the search with the confidence of a man who believed he had his quarry cornered. Beside him rode a figure Jack didn't recognize, a lean man in expensive riding clothes whose very presence suggested money and influence behind this pursuit. Jack lowered the spyglass and returned to Ghost, who was waiting with the patient alertness of a soldier preparing for battle. The wolf's intelligence had always impressed Jack, but now it seemed almost supernatural. Ghost understood that their sanctuary was about to become a battlefield. "Time to earn our keep," Jack said, checking his rifle and the ammunition in his belt. He had enough cartridges for a sustained fight, but not enough to waste on poor shots or missed opportunities. Jack had learned defensive tactics during the Indian campaigns, but this would be different. Then he'd been fighting to impose order on a resistant landscape. Now he was fighting to protect something sacred, the last remnant of a relationship between species that the modern world seemed determined to destroy. The ancient fire pits scattered throughout the valley took on new significance as Jack planned his defense. Each one represented a position where he could make a stand, forcing the attackers to expose themselves while he remained concealed. The knowledge that Ghost's ancestors had once shared these same campfires with their human partners gave Jack strength he hadn't expected. Ghost seemed to understand the tactical situation without explanation. As Jack prepared his defensive positions, the wolf ranged ahead to scout approaches and mark potential ambush sites. They moved together with the coordination of a military unit, each understanding their role in the coming confrontation. Jack set up his primary position in the rocks above, the cave entrance, where he could command views of multiple approaches while maintaining access to their supplies and shelter. The ancient people who had lived here had chosen their home site well. It was naturally defensible, with clear sightlines and multiple escape routes. From his saddlebags, Jack pulled the collection of traps and snares he'd constructed during their 2 weeks of preparation. These weren't designed to kill, but to slow and discourage pursuit. Properly placed, they would channel the attackers into positions where Jack's rifle could be most effective. Ghost watched as Jack positioned each trap with military precision, learning the pattern so he could avoid the hazards while leading enemies into them. The wolf's ability to understand complex tactical concepts continued to amaze Jack. Ghost grasped not just the immediate danger of each trap, but its purpose in the larger defensive scheme. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Jack heard the first sounds of the posse discovering the hidden entrance. Voices carried up through the canyon walls, excitement, determination, and the particular tone of men who believed they had their prey trapped. Jack checked his pocket watch. 4:30. Enough daylight left for a sustained assault, but not enough for the attackers to fully explore the valley's defensive possibilities. If he could hold them off until darkness, the advantage would shift in his favor. Ghost had taken position on a ledge that gave him oversight of the entire valley floor. From there, he could signal Jack about enemy movements while staying clear of the main battle. The wolf's role wasn't to fight. Jack couldn't bear the thought of losing him to human violence, but to serve as his eyes and early warning system. The map Jack had drawn now seemed prophetic, as events unfolded exactly as he'd predicted. The first riders to enter the valley spread out cautiously, clearly expecting resistance. Behind them, more men appeared at regular intervals, moving with the discipline of a well-organized force. Jack recognized Sheriff Hawkins among the riders, but the man directing the operation was the stranger in expensive clothes. This newcomer had the bearing of someone accustomed to command, and his presence explained the professional quality of the pursuit. Through his spyglass, Jack watched as the stranger studied the valley, with obvious appreciation for its defensive qualities. This wasn't going to be a simple matter of overwhelming force. It would be a battle between Jack's knowledge of the terrain and his opponent's superior numbers. Ghost's warning howl from the ledge alerted Jack to movement on the north rim. As expected, some of the attackers were trying to reach the high ground where they could command the entire valley. Jack had prepared for this possibility, but it meant the battle would have to begin sooner than he'd hoped. Jack pulled out his journal one last time and wrote quickly, "If I don't survive what's coming, whoever finds this should know that Ghost isn't what they think he is. He's the last of a line that has been partner to humans for generations. This valley is sacred ground where our kinds once lived in peace. That's worth fighting for." He closed the journal and secured it in a waterproof pouch, then checked his rifle one final time. The first shot would announce the beginning of the end, either his end or the end of the pursuit that had driven them to this place. Ghost's amber eyes met his across the distance, and Jack saw in them the same resolve. He felt in his own heart they had found something worth defending, and they would defend it together. The sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls as Jack settled into his firing position and waited for the battle to begin. Jack's father's rifle felt solid and familiar in his hands as he drew a bead on the lead rider entering the valley. The Winchester had been crafted in Hartford 25 years ago, its walnut stock worn smooth by 2 generations of Sullivan hands. His father had used it to protect the family ranch, and his grandfather had carried it through 3 Indian wars before that. Now it would serve to protect the last remnant of something even older, a bond between species that predated the conflicts, that had shaped the modern West. The stranger in expensive clothes raised his hand to halt the column of riders at the valley's center, clearly sensing the trap they'd ridden into. Jack could see him studying the defensive positions with the eye of someone who understood military tactics. This wasn't going to be the simple arrest the man had probably expected. Through his spyglass, Jack watched Sheriff Hawkins dismount and approach the stranger with obvious deference. Money and influence were speaking here, but Jack couldn't make out the words that passed between them. Whatever was said, it resulted in hand signals that sent riders spreading out in a pattern that confirmed Jack's worst suspicions about their opponent's competence. Ghost's warning bark from the ledge drew Jack's attention to the northern rim, where movement among the rocks revealed at least 3 men working their way into position. The pincer movement Jack had anticipated was developing exactly as his map had predicted, but knowing what was coming didn't make it easier to counter. Jack sighted down the barrel of his father's rifle and made a decision that would start a war. His first shot wasn't aimed to kill, but to announce that the valley had teeth. The bullet struck stone 3 feet from the nearest rider, sending chips of granite flying and causing the horse to rear in alarm. The valley erupted into chaos as men scrambled for cover and horses plunged in panic. But the chaos was controlled. Professional. These weren't amateurs who would be easily discouraged by a single warning shot. "Sullivan!" The stranger's voice carried clearly across the valley, amplified by the canyon walls. "I'm Federal Marshal Clayton Webb. You're under arrest for theft of government property and interfering with lawful execution of justice." Government property. Jack felt a cold anger settle in his stomach as the implications became clear. Ghost, Wasn't just a wolf that had killed some sheep. He was somehow classified as federal property, which explained the resources being devoted to his recapture. "The wolf belongs with his own kind," Jack shouted back, working the lever of his rifle to chamber another round. "Not in some government cage." Webb's response was to wave his men forward. The attack began with professional precision, riders dismounting and taking cover while others provided covering fire. Jack's first defensive position came under immediate pressure from multiple directions. The Winchester spoke again, this time with deadly intent. A hired gun who'd gotten too bold in his approach spun around and dropped behind a boulder, clutching his shoulder. Jack's military training had taught him to shoot center mass, but some part of him still hoped this could end without killing. Ghost's position on the ledge gave him oversight of the entire battle, and his warning calls kept Jack informed of threats he couldn't see from his limited viewpoint. When riders tried to flank around the eastern approach, Ghost's howl alerted Jack in time to shift his fire and drive them back. But the numbers were telling. For every position Jack could cover, 2 more were left exposed. The men on the northern rim were working steadily closer, and Jack could hear sounds of movement on the southern approach as well. A bullet whined off the rock beside Jack's head, close enough that he felt the heat of its passage. Marshal Webb's men were finding the range, and Jack's position was becoming untenable. Time to fall back to the secondary position. Jack grabbed his ammunition and sprinted toward the cave entrance, using the ancient fire pits for cover as bullets kicked up dirt around his feet. Ghost leaped down from his ledge to join the retreat, moving with the fluid grace that made him nearly impossible to target. The cave entrance provided better protection, but it also limited Jack's fields of fire. He was trading mobility for security, and in a battle against superior numbers, that might be a losing proposition. Webb's voice echoed off the canyon walls again. "Give up the wolf, Sullivan, and you'll get a fair trial. Keep fighting, and I can't guarantee your safety." Jack's response was another shot from his father's rifle, aimed at the marshal's general position. He might not survive this battle, but he'd make Webb understand that some things were worth dying. 4 Ghost pressed against Jack's side, and Jack could feel the wolf's steady heartbeat against his leg. Whatever happened next, they would face it together, the last inheritors of an ancient partnership that had survived everything the modern world could throw at it. The battle was just beginning, but Jack already knew how it had to end. One way or another, Ghost would never see the inside of another cage. A lone eagle feather drifted down from the canyon rim as the battle reached its crescendo, settling on the stone beside Jack's rifle like a blessing from the spirits of the wild. Jack glanced at it for a moment, seeing in its perfect structure a reminder of what he was fighting to preserve: the freedom of creatures to live according to their nature. Marshal Webb had stopped trying to negotiate and committed his full force to the assault. Men were working their way up both sides of the canyon now, using ropes and climbing gear that suggested they'd come prepared for exactly this kind of siege. Jack's defensive positions were being systematically eliminated, forcing him deeper into the cave complex. Ghost had proven invaluable as a tactical partner, using his superior speed and agility to harass the attackers from unexpected angles. The wolf would appear on a ledge behind advancing men, force them to take cover, then vanish before they could bring their weapons to bear. It wasn't enough to stop the advance, but it slowed them down and kept them nervous. Jack's ammunition was running low, down to his last dozen cartridges, but his father's rifle had served him well. 3 of Webb's men were out of action, wounded but not killed, which had been Jack's intention. This wasn't about taking lives, it was about proving that some things couldn't be taken by force. A sound from deeper in the cave made Jack spin around. Rifle ready. One of Webb's men had found another entrance, working his way through the tunnel system to emerge behind Jack's position. But as the man stepped into the light, Ghost materialized from the shadows like a gray phantom. The hired gun's scream echoed through the cave as Ghost landed on his back, driving him to the ground without actually biting. The wolf's message was clear: surrender or face the consequences. The man dropped his weapon and lay still, understanding that he was alive only because Ghost chose mercy over violence. "Good boy," Jack said, and Ghost's amber eyes met his in perfect understanding. But the distraction had cost them. When Jack turned back toward the main entrance, Marshal Webb was standing just outside, his own rifle trained on Jack's position. "End of the line, Sullivan," Webb called. "You've fought well, but you're outnumbered and outgunned. Send the wolf out, and you can surrender with some dignity intact." Jack could see the other men taking positions around the cave entrance, but something had changed in their posture. They were maintaining their professional formation, but there was less eagerness in their movements, less certainty in their purpose. "You want him?" Jack called back. "Come and take him." Ghost moved to stand beside Jack, positioning himself between the man and the cave entrance. The wolf's hackles were raised, but he wasn't snarling or showing aggression. Instead, he projected the calm confidence of a creature that knew exactly what it was capable of. Webb stepped closer, and Jack could see the federal marshal's face clearly for the first time. This wasn't a cruel man or a mindless bureaucrat. This was someone trying to do his job according to his understanding of law and order. That made him more dangerous than simple evil would have been. "The wolf is government property," Webb said, his voice carrying the authority of federal law. "Bred in a military program, escaped during transport. You're harboring stolen goods, Sullivan." Jack felt the pieces click into place. Ghost hadn't been wild-caught at all. He was the product of some government breeding program, probably designed to recreate the wolf-human partnerships the ancient paintings had depicted. The irony was staggering. The government had tried to artificially recreate what had existed naturally for centuries, then lost control of their own creation. "He's not property," Jack said quietly. "He's a living being with the right to choose his own destiny. The law doesn't recognize that distinction," Webb replied. "Animals are property under federal statute." Ghost stepped forward, placing himself directly in the line of fire between Jack and Webb. The gesture was unmistakable. The wolf was making his own choice about where his loyalty lay. Webb hesitated, his rifle wavering slightly. Behind him, Jack could hear murmurs among the other men as they witnessed Ghost's deliberate act of protection. "You see that?" Jack called out to the assembled men. "He's choosing, not following orders or responding to training, choosing. That wolf is more free than any of us." Sheriff Hawkins moved up beside Webb, his own weapon lowered. "Maybe we should reconsider this, Marshal. The wolf doesn't seem dangerous to anyone but those who threaten its friend." Webb's rifle remained steady, but Jack could see uncertainty growing in the federal marshal's eyes. The simple narrative of law enforcement capturing a criminal was becoming complicated by the obvious bond between man and wolf. Ghost's amber eyes never left Webb's face, and in that steady gaze, everyone present could see intelligence that challenged their assumptions about the nature of wild creatures. "Stand down," Webb said finally, though whether he was speaking to his men or to Jack remained unclear. The wooden sign that marked the entrance to Ghost Valley Ranch was rough-hewn from pine, carved with letters that spoke of patience and permanence rather than haste. Jack had spent 3 weeks working on it during the previous autumn, taking his time with each letter until the words captured exactly what this place had become. 6 months had passed since Marshal Webb had made his decision to walk away from the Hidden Valley, taking his men and their federal authority back to a world that measured everything in terms of property and law. Webb had been a good man caught between duty and conscience, and in the end, conscience had won. The marshal's report, Jack had learned later, classified the entire incident as a case of mistaken identity. The wolf in question had not been the escaped government property after all, but a wild animal that had died during the pursuit. It was a fiction that allowed everyone to save face while leaving Jack and Ghost in peace. Ghost appeared from the morning shadows as Jack finished his daily check of the boundary markers. moving with the silent grace that had inspired his name. The wolf was fuller now, his coat thick and lustrous from good feeding and steady companionship. The scars from his battle with the mountain lion had faded to thin silver lines that spoke of survival rather than suffering. But Ghost was no longer alone in the valley. 3 younger wolves had joined them over the winter, Ghost's offspring with a wild female who had appeared during the autumn mating season. The pups were growing fast, already showing the intelligence and calm demeanor that marked their fathers. Lineage. Jack knelt and extended his hand, allowing Ghost to press his muzzle against his palm in their daily greeting ritual. The touch had become as natural as breathing, a connection that transcended the barriers between species. "Morning, partner," Jack said, and Ghost's ears pricked forward in acknowledgement. The pups emerged from their den near the cave entrance, tumbling over each other in the way of young creatures everywhere. They had accepted Jack as part of their pack from birth, showing none of the wariness that might be expected between predator and human. To them, the partnership between their father and the 2-legged alpha was simply the natural order of their world. Jack's morning routine took him through the established circuits of their territory, checking the snares that provided meat for the pack, tending the small garden where he grew vegetables and herbs, maintaining the structures that made human life possible in this remote sanctuary. The cave paintings had become his evening entertainment, their ancient stories taking on new meaning as Jack lived the reality they depicted. He'd added his own images to the walls, scenes of Ghost's rescue, their journey to the valley, the battle with Webb's forces. Future generations would understand the continuity that connected past and present. A sound from the valley entrance made both Jack and Ghost alert. Visitors were rare, but not unheard of. Over the months, word had spread among certain circles that Ghost Valley Ranch was a place where problems with predators could be solved through understanding rather than violence. The rider who emerged from the hidden entrance was a woman Jack recognized, Sarah Mackenzie, whose homestead lay 30 miles to the east. She'd lost sheep to wolf predation and had come seeking the kind of help that bullets couldn't provide. Jack walked to meet her, Ghost trotting beside him with the calm confidence of a creature secure in his territory. The woman's horse was nervous at the wolf's approach, but Ghost maintained enough distance to avoid causing panic. "Mr. Sullivan," Sarah called as she dismounted, "I hate to bother you, but I'm at my wit's end with these wolves taking my stock." Jack had handled a dozen similar requests over the past months, each one an opportunity to demonstrate that coexistence was possible with patience and understanding. Most predation problems stemmed from desperation or territory disputes that could be resolved without bloodshed. "Tell me about it," Jack said, gesturing toward the fire pit where he conducted most of his consultations. As Sarah described her situation, Ghost settled nearby with the patient attention of a creature who understood the importance of these conversations. The wolf had become as much a part of Jack's consultation process as his own knowledge and experience. "The pack leader is probably a young male establishing territory," Jack explained, after hearing the details. "If we can give him alternative prey sources and mark boundaries he'll respect, your sheep should be safe without having to kill anything." Sarah's relief was visible as Jack outlined a solution that preserved both her livestock and the wild pack's right to exist. These consultations had become Jack's mission, proving that the ancient partnerships depicted in the cave paintings could work in the modern world. That evening, as Sarah rode away with specific instructions and renewed hope, Jack sat beside his fire and pulled out his journal. The pages were filled now with observations about wolf behavior, notes on successful interventions, and sketches of the growing pack that called Ghost Valley home. 6 months since Webb's visit, he wrote. The valley has become what it was always meant to be, a place where the old agreements between our kinds can flourish. Ghost's pups are growing strong, and word is spreading that there are alternatives to the war between civilization and the wild. Ghost settled beside Jack's chair, close enough that Jack could rest his hand on the wolf's head while he wrote. The three pups had claimed spots around the fire, their amber eyes reflecting the flames as they dozed in perfect security. The handmade sign at the valley entrance had weathered its first winter well, the carved letters darkened by rain and sun, but still clearly readable. Ghost Valley Ranch, a name that honored both the wolf who had made it possible and the partnership that sustained it. Jack closed his journal and looked up at the stars visible through the canyon opening. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that understanding could triumph over fear. But tonight, surrounded by his pack family in their hidden sanctuary, Jack felt the deep satisfaction that comes from finding your true purpose. Ghost's steady breathing beside him was the sound of contentment. Two species that had found their way back to an ancient friendship, proving that some bonds are too strong for the modern world to break.